Alright, welcome back to the SuperCoach Nuff channel. In this video we're going to go through a bit of a beginner's guide to NRL SuperCoach. So with the new season starting in only just a couple of days, we might have some players that are joining for the first time, or I guess maybe joined in halfway through last year and aren't exactly sure what's going on. I know that I've definitely been talking to some NRL fantasy converts that are thinking about playing Supercoach for the first time. So I thought what we could do is just go through some of the basics of Supercoach. I won't compare it to fantasy, just because that could be confusing if you're completely new to the idea of fantasy sports. Um, but we'll talk about Supercoach and I guess some basic strategies and ideas around it. So I guess at its most simplest, you get a budget of 11.65 million, so it's supposed to be the same as the actual NRL salary cap. But unlike the actual NRL salary cap for the team, you only have to pick 25 players instead of 30. But with that, you do get 46 trades throughout the year, so you can trade someone out, or sorry, take someone out of your team and bring someone else into your team. And the players' prices are based on a 3-week average. So at the start of the year, they're based off the season average from last year. But their sort of 3-week performance will see their price change. So if they're in good form and scoring well, they'll rise in price. If they're not doing so well and their average is below their sort of average performance, then they will drop in price. So it's a little bit like a stock market type thing where you obviously want to buy low, sell high, um, but there is probably some more nuance to it than just that. So with the team of 25 players, there's certain positions that the players are assigned to, and in the main, they are translated to their positions in the actual team. So for Supercoach, you have to have hookers. So two hookers, one that starts on the field, one that sits on the bench. Front row forwards, which are your props. You've got two on the field, two on the bench. Second row forwards, so that's the second row, and the lock forward counts as a second row forward generally. You have three on the field, three on the bench. Halfback, so 1 and 1. 5/8, 1 and 1. So centre wing, so centres and wings. You have 4 on the field, 3 on the bench. You can play 4 wingers on your field. You don't have to separate the wings and the centres because they're not necessarily separated in Supercoach anyway. And fullback, you've got 1 on the field, 1 on the bench. So you end up with the starting 13 and then 12 players on the bench. You can also have, though, what is called a dual position player, or generally called DPP for short. So I've got Tino Fa'asuamaleaui there, and I don't know why I picked the hardest name in the game to include in this one, but you can see he's eligible to be picked as a second rower as well as a front rower. So he does play a bit of lock forward, a bit of prop forward as well. So for that reason, he has dual position eligibility. So he can sit in either position in your team. Some other common ones are fullbacks and centre wings have a bit of flexibility, often 5/8 and halfbacks. You can also have some more interesting combinations, like this year we've got Drew Hutchinson as a centre wing and a halfback. Pretty rare combination, but it can happen. So when you're setting up your team, there's a few factors to consider, and I guess basically I've put these into 3 tiers. So I think the top tier, or the top factor you need to consider, is value. All right, as we said, it's like a stock market type game where we want to buy low, sell high. So obviously we're looking for players that offer value, in that we predict that they'll outscore their average based on what they're currently priced at. After that, there's probably a few other things that are important to consider, and everyone will place a different level of priority on these things. So I've got job security there. which is, I guess, how likely the player is to stay in the team. A high ceiling, or what we call upside, so an ability for a player to score a lot of points in any given week, and a high floor, so the probability that on a down week that a player will still score pretty well. And I guess it depends on your personal preference and risk appetite as to which one you factor in. For me, I used to sort of take the high floor approach, but after a few years of playing, I've found that the high ceiling or the upside approach is probably the biggest factor, um, because that's what makes the difference in the overall points and can get you wins in your head to head league. So, some of my picks, I know Viliami Kikau is probably one that a lot of people aren't keen on, but he has shown in the past he has that high upside. He might have a slightly lower floor. He doesn't always play 80 minutes, but given that he knows how to score a try and can set up the players outside of him for tries, he has that upside, which I'm really keen to get involved with. Guess job security is fairly important too. So I guess an example of that in my team currently is Jack Bostock, who looks like he's pretty much going to be the left winger for the Dolphins for the course of the year. It's his spot to lose. So obviously picking him over some cheaper options that are riskier in terms of their job security makes more sense in that sense. And then after that, once you've sort of got those main factors out of the way, and you might be still tossing up between two similar players, I guess some ways to differentiate them are their injury history. So I know, for example, Tom Travojevic um, has awesome job security, awesome ceiling, has a pretty high floor too because of his work rate, but he does have a lot of issues with injuries over the time. So that can put some players off because obviously if they're injured, they're not scoring points for you, and you're not winning your head to head. You're not moving up the overall ladder. But that's one thing that could differentiate those players. Team schedule. So some people will look at who the players got coming up in the next 2 3 games. So obviously, if a team is struggling defensively, um, in the like for the opposition, then your player might have a bit more upside. Also buys. So obviously, if you've got a player who's got a couple of buys coming up in quick succession, you may want to not pick them. And I guess another tiebreaker is what we call a pod or a point of difference. Um, and basically, I guess the general rule for a pod is about lower ownership. So if there's two players that you can't split on any of those other factors, you may look at, well, which one's less commonly owned, and you may choose to go that direction in the hope that it will help you stand out from the pack. Obviously, that can backfire too. Some people prefer to go with the crowd, and particularly early in the season, that's probably not the worst bet because obviously, if that player suffers, you suffer a bit, but obviously, so does everyone else. So it's all relative. So I guess those are the things that we're considering. As I said, value above all else, and then I guess the sort of the scoring in general, I guess is how you could categorize those middle factors, and then I guess the little factors that can break a tie between two very similar players. So I guess talking about setting up your team and looking for value. Um, a popular strategy that is used is what we call guns and rookies, or I know in American football it's called studs and duds or stars and scrubs. A couple of variations on the theme. I like studs and duds myself, but essentially what it is looking at using cheap rookie players, or what we call cheapies in Supercoach tech terminology, and that allows us to get the more expensive but more proven guns into our team. So while guns typically don't have a lot of value, they still offer things like those high floors, high upside, job security, which are those factors that we're looking for. Um, so maximizing we want to try to maximize the amount of top players in our team. That's ultimately what we're trying to get to. So accessing cheap players that offer value is a way of being able to make that happen. In saying that, the strategy is dependent on there actually being cheapy options available. And based on trials this year, it looks like there will be a fair few. There's been a couple pop up in the team list for the Vegas games. But yeah, so I guess, listed there, I've got an example of a gun. So Nico Hines, most expensive player in the game, but he's most expensive for a reason. He had the highest average last season. He plays in a pretty good team, the Sharks. They should be in finals contention. He kicks goals. He's the main focal point of their attack, so he has a lot of upside. But his sort of style of play, he always has a lot of runs and a lot of involvement, so he has that high floor. So he's the sort of player we want to make room for in our team. And the way we do that is through cheap players. So I've listed Samuel Hughes here as a potential cheapie. Um, the fact that the Bulldogs don't have a lot of strength in their middle forwards currently, um, and he's been hyped up in the pre-season by a lot of players, and even the Gus Gould there at the Dogs, saying that he's ready to go to that next level. So what we're hoping for is he'll get more minutes and more activity in the game, and his price will elevate. But his cheaper starting point allows us to also have Nico Hines in the team. So some common mistakes when selecting your team. Um, I guess there's a few different ones here, and I've sort of got an example of each listed here. So non-playing cheapies are what we call nuffs. Funnily enough, that's what the channel is named after. Um, but essentially, these players that you know are super cheap, which means we can bring in those proven guns. However, they're not playing, so they're not scoring points and they're not creating value for us. So traditionally, in the past, some people have carried one cheapie nuff on the bench as a loophole option, which we'll talk about a bit later. But now that we have an odd number of teams and there's at least one team with a bye every week, you don't necessarily need a non-playing cheapie to use that loophole. So it's just meaning that you're missing out on value. So I've listed Chevy Stewart as an example of that. He was pretty hyped up in the preseason. A lot of people saying he should play fullback at some time this year for the Raiders. However, he's probably not going to start in round one. It looks like Jordan Rapana is going to start at fullback. It's not to say Rapana won't get suspended or injured because he's Jordan Rapana, and Chevy Stewart will get some game time there at fullback. But we can just wait till he does get that game time, and then we can trade him in. We have 46 trades, so we don't need to start with him. I guess the next sort of common mistake is players with little value or upside. Um, and so I've got Patrick Carrigan as an example of this. So super great player for SuperCoach. Super great player in NRL terminology. As you can see, he's the seventh most expensive second rower. However, his price there is his price. He'll score a very consistent 60, 65 every week, but won't really go, much above that. So there's no upside to the pick, and because he's priced at his average and he scores his average, there's no value in that pick. So for that reason, we don't want to start with these players. They're probably good at the back end of the season when we want to, have some bankable scores and then obviously go for some upside. But to start with, we're chasing value. Another common mistake is going for players with low job security. So Jacob Gagai is a pretty popular one. He was one I was keen on for a bit. But when I realised that he's only playing in round one because Isaac Thompson wasn't allowed to go to America because of some legal issues in the past, uh, it says to me that Gagai will play one game. He's not in the top 30 squad. He's not even in the supplementary squad. They had to make an exemption because of South's injuries and legal issues in the back line to get him over there to play. It's not to say that he won't get another game in the NRL, but I think he has to wait until later in the season as he's a New South Wales Cup contracted player. So for that reason, I'm not starting with him because he's only going to play 1 week. And as we said, the prices are based on a 3 round average. So the prices won't actually change until at least round 4. And for players with a bye, they've got to wait another week, obviously, to play their 3 games and have their price change. So Jacob Gagelai's price won't really change. So even if he played this week, I probably wouldn't start him in the team. So there's no value in the pick. And I guess another common mistake is players with poor roles. So I actually put the wrong player in here. Tyson Smoothie got named on the bench for the Broncos. I put Corey Pakes in there by mistake. I'm not picking on the Broncos as much as I am a non-Broncos fan in Brisbane, but he generally would play off the bench as a hooker, so that usually means he's only playing 30 to 40 minutes. And bench hookers are usually a terrible role for Supercoach scoring. So we try to avoid them. And other positions that have low minutes or low scoring potential, we want to try to avoid. So when you're putting together your team, you have your starting 13 every week, and then you select 4 reserves. So it can be any of those 12 players that you've accessed or selected on the bench, I should say. You just add the reserve to 4 of them, and you'll get the 17 players' scores for the round. I didn't mention it on here, but there is also a provision for what's called an auto emergency, which is where if one of your players isn't playing, you get the lowest player's score out of the non-picked reserves. So, out of your 25 playing squad, if someone scores a 10, that would become the auto emergency score. Um, and I guess you might hear the term auto emergency nightmare being thrown around. That's referring to those poor players with poor roles and stuff we talked about before that, don't have a lot of upside. You risk getting their low score as an auto emergency if, you have a late out. In saying that, it's still better than scoring 0. Um, so it's not the worst thing in the world. Um, I guess the difference with the starting 17 is in rounds 13, 16, or 19, what we call the Origin bye rounds. So they're the rounds that lead up to Origin. And with each of those rounds, there's 7 teams on bye, which means there's only 10 teams playing. Makes it pretty hard to field 17 players out of 10 teams. Um, so those weeks, you only have to have 13 players. You can have 17, 18, 19 players, or I guess you can only select 17 players in your team. But even if you have 17, you only get the best 13 scores. So if you have those cheapies, you just throw someone that's super cheap to get 20 points for 1 game. It's probably not worth that trade because they're not going to count if you've got 13 better scoring players. But once you've selected your 17, you do set a captain and a vice captain. And then I guess the other thing with selecting your team, which is a bit nuanced about Supercoach, is you want to try and pick reserves that played later in the round. And so I've actually got an example from my team here. So I don't know if you can see the cursor too well, but on the left, my front row, and this is a little bit of an update from my last video. So if you're looking at this going, this isn't the team you posted. I had Terrell May and Xavier Willison in the front row, but particularly after the news that Willison is probably going to get axed for Marty Taupau, Tapu, however you're supposed to say his name now. Apologies, Marty, former Bulldogs great. Uh, but I've just switched Terrell May and Willison to Henry and Flegler. All right, but the Toller's obviously playing in the first game for the round, so he's fine to start. I've got Flegler, I've got Sam Hughes on my bench. But Sam Hughes plays, I think, about the 5th game of the round, and Tom Flegler plays the last game on Sunday afternoon next week, like the last game of the round. So if something was to happen to Tom Flegler and he wasn't to start, if I have him in my starting spot, I can't, swap him for Henry because Henry's already played, Hughes has already played. So I'd be forced to sort of trade Flegler out for another Dolphins or Cowboys front rower. And obviously, after this week, we don't have unlimited trades, so you wouldn't want to be trading out that pick anyway. So if you're going to pick the three front rowers, what you should do is pick Totola and Hughes because they play earlier in the round. And obviously, if Hughes gets dropped, we can just switch Flegler in and, you know, bench Henry or whatever we need to do. All right. But, with Flegler playing the last game, if he pulls out, we can go to another reserve, whether it's in the centre wing or a fullback slot that's playing in that game if we need to. So it just gives you a bit more flexibility through the round if you load up. So I did the same thing with the second row. So Piakura, you know, I had on my bench, but realistically, because he's playing in Vegas, we can lock him in. And then it just gives a bit more flexibility if one of my other five second rowers is missing. So a couple of examples there of, your team doesn't necessarily have to have the most expensive players on the field. It's not like you're naming them to run out on the field. You're naming them to maximise your Supercoach score. So another common strategy, and this ties into what we talked about with auto emergencies and selecting your vice captain and captain, is the vice captain loophole. So what the vice captain loophole is essentially is giving yourself two goes at getting a high score for your captain, because your captain every week scores double, right? And the vice captain is only there in case your captain doesn't play, so you don't miss out on double the score. But there is a loophole with that we can exploit. And how it works is we need to select a vice captain, and generally they have to play earlier in the round for it to work well. So ideally the first 2 to 3 games. And then we select a captain who plays after the vice captain. And the reason for that is we can look at changing the captain right up until the captain plays, essentially. So it's a little bit different to fantasy. If you played fantasy, you'll know the captain and vice captain lock out at the first game of the round as a way of closing this loophole, essentially. But in Supercoach, it's open, so we might as well use it. So we select the vice captain who plays early, we select the captain who plays after, and if the vice captain scores well, what we do is we swap the captaincy onto a non-playing player. So ideally a player that's on a bye, this works best for. Um, but if we have like a enough player that hasn't their team hasn't played yet, they still technically won't be locked out, and we can use it on them too. But with the players on bye, they only lock out after the last game starts. So perfect opportunity to use this vice captain loophole. And then what we do is we give them the captaincy. So because they're not playing, they're on a bye, they won't score as captain, so we get our vice captain score as our captain. So it's basically getting 2 bites at getting a good captaincy score. And so again, I've set this up for round one. So on the left here, you can see I've got Kalen Ponga as my vice captain. He's going to be playing in the third game of the week. So playing Thursday night next week against the Raiders. And then I've got Cleary as captain, who plays, I think, on Saturday night after Ponga. So basically, if Ponga doesn't score well, that's fine. I'll just take Cleary as my captain. But if Ponga goes well and say scores 120, or everyone has different numbers about what they'll take as captain. And I guess that comes down to your auto emergency options. So what we would do, as you can see, currently I've got it set up that I've got Grant. Oh, go back. I didn't mean to actually click. I just wanted to hover. So I've currently got Grant as my hooker, and I've got Api Coruscant on the bench. So he's on the bye this week. So this sort of helps for the loophole. And then my front row we've already seen. So what I would do is I'd swap Api Coruscant with Harry Grant and put the captaincy on Api Coruscant. But then obviously because I want Appy to play, because I want Harry Grant to play, I need to take the reserve off of Flegler and put it on Grant. But then obviously, if I have to choose between Flegler and Hughes, I'd prefer Flegler to start. So I'm going to swap them around as well. So you can see why you want your vice captain playing earlier in the week is because there is actually a few moving pieces involved. So obviously, the earlier that your vice captain plays, the easier it is to maneuver those other pieces around to make the loophole work. All right, so hopefully that helps explain it. Probably a video demonstration would be better, but I can't. I'm not that good with PowerPoint to be honest, which is a bit embarrassing to say as a technology teacher, but that's fine. Um, but yeah, I guess talking a bit more about trades as well. So every week you get two trades to use. Um, so up until the end of round one, you have unlimited to set your team up as much as possible. But then after round one, it's two trades each week. So obviously, there's not quite enough to do two trades each week throughout the year. You've only got 46 in total. So you do have to be a bit strategic about your trades. I guess a couple other things to consider is there's three trades in rounds 13, 16, and 19. So for Origin, we talked about best 13. So you don't have to have 13 ready to go into round 13 or into round 16. You can do three trades to get that to go. And you also have five trade boosts. So a trade boost is where you can add an additional trade for the round, and that can be applied to any round. So if it's just like round six, you'd get three trades instead of two. If it's for round 13 that you want to use the trade boost, you actually get four trades instead of three. So pretty cool feature they've only added in, I think, the last couple of years. Um, Definitely has added a different element to the game, which is really interesting. So I guess the question is then, well, when's the best time to use trades and use boosts? And ultimately, it comes down to the gameplay style that you're looking at. So if you are trying to focus on the overall game and try to win I think it's $50,000 that they offer up, Daily Telegraph and KFC and all that. It seems like the best strategy is to be aggressive. So trade early, trade often, because you want to try and build the value of your squad as quickly as you can, and sort of get to a space where you have, 17 of those guns that you can sort of play every week. You probably need 18 or 19 with the buys. Um, and I know, like last year, with the amount of value that we had in the team, I think I ended up with like 21 gun players in my squad that I was just rotating through. Cut like injuries weren't an issue, but in saying that, I'd also used all of my trades, so it's a balance. If you're playing more head to head, like you're just playing a competition against your mates and you want to beat them, try to be a bit more conservative with the trades, because what you want to try to do is have trades in reserve for the head to head finals, which are generally like weeks 23 to 26. Might be different depending on your league settings. But that's when you want to be able to use those trades when other players that might have been a bit more aggressive don't have trades. And towards the end of the season, there's always injuries, suspensions, teams go on a run of form that you want to get on. So that's when you want to use the trades for that. Um, I guess probably one thing to try and do is use the trades fairly tactically around Origin time. So obviously looking at buys and who's going to play what weeks. I actually did a video about that to give myself a shameless plug here. If you want to go back and have a look at my buy analysis, and sort of when to target trades in and out for teams. I also know that Jamie, I think it is, at NRL and Cricket Analysis, he sort of did something similar. He does focus more on NRL fantasy, but he is playing a bit of SuperCoach, so he's doing a bit of that. But obviously, the buy strategies are similar for both games. So definitely check out his video as well. It's good gear. But one thing you do want to try and do is avoid sideways trades. So what we mean by sideways trade is where you're basically swapping one player for a similar player that doesn't really offer any difference in value. So the example here I've got is, say you start with Ruben Garrick and he gets off to a bit of a slow start, and you look at Nick Meaney at the Storm. all right, and say, well, he's in good form. Maybe I should get on him. Um, if we look at their profiles, they're both playing in the centres. They're both playing for fairly decent teams that attack well. They both kick goals. So realistically, they're one and the same player. So making a move from Garrick to Meany is probably just wasting a trade because potentially things could change and Garrick could start to go on a run of form, or Nick Meaney's form could slide, or I guess for Garrick's case, Tommy Turbo could get injured and he could move to fullback, which would suggest he might have a bit more value. So we want to try to avoid those trades. Sometimes you do them just because you're sick of looking at Ruben Garrick's terrible scores every week. That's what we call a rage trade, and it's perfectly natural. So we want to avoid it, but obviously these things happen from time to time. So some other tips. So you just want to avoid picking too many players from one team. I know particularly this year, maybe every year, I have high hopes for the Bulldogs being my team. And at different stages, I've had as many as 6 and 7 Bulldogs players in my team. Obviously, you could trade them out before their first buy in round 9. They do offer a pretty good buy schedule over the origin period, which is nice. But then if you're trying to cover 6, 7 players in round 9, your 17 is going to be pretty thin. So yeah, you want to try to avoid too many from one team. You also want to avoid chasing points. And what we mean by chasing points is a little bit like that sideways trading we were talking about before. So there might be a player who averages 30 points. And then one week he goes off, he scores 3 tries, gets 140 super coach points, and you think, oh, he offers value. His break even is super low, so he's going to rise in price. And if he's done it before, maybe he can do it again. Uh, you know, you what you the problem with that is that you're not going to get that 140 points because he's already scored it when he wasn't in your team. So bringing him in, chances are you're just going to get those 30 points for the next couple of weeks. He might make some money, sure, but then you've got to trade him back out because you don't want to lose all that money that you've gained. So chasing points, is often a way that trades evaporate very quickly. Um, I guess another tip is to follow the Supercoach channels here on YouTube. Another shameless plug. But I guess, it's not just me, that's for sure. Like I already mentioned, Jamie over at NRL and Cricket Analysis. He does some great stuff, but like I said, it is more fantasy leaning. Aman talks NRL Supercoach. He's really good on like diving into the stats and all that. It's not something I do a lot of. I'm a bit more gut feel and the eye test and a quick look at the numbers, and then we'll just make it up as we go. And then I've listed the Supercoach experience here. There seems to be quite a few sort of podcast style channels. Um, there was a couple of others that are pretty common. I think Supercoach Playbook, I think it's called. Um, the other one completely escapes me. Um, but it's about getting as much information as you can. And I guess like the inspiration for this channel actually came from me looking at channels for AFL Supercoach. I'm obviously not a big AFL fan, but looking at channels like George and JD's and DR's, um, and they sort of have a similar style to this, which is why I've adopted this style of just talking at the camera while sitting on the couch. It might be a little bit more relaxed than those boys. They have proper desk setups and all that. But that's where I get my information around AFL Supercoach, and that helps me make my decisions. So, if you want to get into it, obviously look at the people who spend time thinking about it, talking about it, all that sort of stuff, and I'll include myself in that conversation. But probably the most important tip is to have fun with it. As much as we've talked about strategies and diving in, if you want to have a team that's made up of all Bulldogs players, I actually tried it last year and called it the Bulldog Project. It was good fun. I think I finished about 50,000 overall with them. But essentially, it was just the first sort of half a dozen weeks was just trade boosting and trying to get as many of them out as I could to get actual Supercoach players in. um, but yeah, if you want to start with kick out, you start with kick out. If you want to start with Carrigan because he's your favourite player, you start with Pat Carrigan. If you want to not pick Manly players because you hate Manly, don't pick Tommy Turbo or Ben Travojevic. Popular cheapie. If you don't want him, don't have him. Because it's supposed to be a fun thing. It is interesting to see some super coach channels and that pop up, and then players don't have a good week, and then all of a sudden you don't see a video from them ever again. But yeah, it's supposed to be fun, so get out there, enjoy it. You know, have all the mad chats with everyone, and get involved. That's what it's all about. So pretty sure that covers everything I wanted to discuss in this video. So as always, if you've got any comments, thoughts, obviously questions, if you are a beginner and I didn't explain things very clearly, let me know in the comment section below this video. If you enjoy the Supercoach content, remember to give the videos a like, subscribe for all the fantasy content. Um, as I said, I will do some stuff around AFL. I've been doing EPL this season if you want to follow along with that. And then obviously all the NRL stuff is about to kick off, which is awesome. And yeah, other than that, we'll catch you in the next one.